Princess Anne emerged from Windsor Castle at 11:22 this morning, and the look on her face stopped people cold. Those who know her best recognized it instantly. Controlled devastation, carefully held in place, but unmistakable. The emergency family meeting she had just left had stretched on for 4 long hours, and it ended with a decision so severe that even Anne, known for her emotional restraint, struggled to maintain composure. What she is about to announce will change the royal family forever. This was the meeting that was never meant to happen. The message did not arrive loudly, and it did not arrive widely. Instead, it moved through a narrow corridor of authority that exists only for moments when routine collapses completely. Those who received it recognized the format immediately, because it is only used when there is no margin left. There was no subject line, no justification, no softening language, only a brief, unmistakable instruction. Presence was required at Windsor as soon as dawn allowed. No one needed to ask why. And by the time the eastern sky began to lighten, movement was already underway across private roads and secured entrances that rarely appear on maps. Vehicles arrived separately, deliberately staggered, without escorts or visible security details. This was not discretion for appearance's sake, it was discretion for control. Princess Anne entered the meeting room before anyone else, carrying no papers and making no calls. She reviewed no notes because she had requested none. What she required at this stage was not briefing, but alignment. She took her seat at the long table without ceremony and waited. King Charles III arrived next. His expression reflected exhaustion rather than alarm, the look of someone who had spent the night absorbing information rather than reacting to it. He paused briefly at the doorway, taking in the room as if measuring whether it could even contain what was about to be discussed. Then he sat, setting aside the usual markers of hierarchy in favour of immediacy. Prince William arrived last. He came without staff, without folders, and without the outward signals of preparation that usually accompanied his engagements. His presence carried a different weight this morning. He was not there as an observer or apprentice. He was there because the matter under discussion directly touched the future. What did not arrive was just as telling. No communications officials were waiting to shape language, and no legal advisors were positioned to identify risk. No aides hovered near the door in case instructions were needed. The room had been stripped of everything that might soften or redirect the conversation. This was not a meeting about response. It was a meeting about reckoning. The setting itself reinforced that reality. The curtains were drawn, not for secrecy, but for focus. The table was bare. No water glasses, no folders, no briefing packs arranged with precision. The space had been intentionally emptied of comfort. The message was implicit. This was not a discussion meant to be prolonged. For a moment, no one spoke. That pause was not hesitation. It was recalibration, as each person present understood they were no longer operating within the usual parameters of palace decision-making. The familiar sequence of options, delay, adjustment, and managed disclosure, had already been exhausted elsewhere. What remained was choice. The information that prompted the gathering had arrived late the previous evening, delivered through professional channels that left no room for interpretation. It had not been filtered through advisors or softened by conditional language. It arrived directly, accompanied by documentation that closed doors rather than opening them. This was not an alert. It was a conclusion. King Charles broke the stillness with a question that carried neither defensiveness nor strategy. He wanted to know whether silence remained an option, not whether it was preferable or convenient or advisable, but whether it was still possible without consequence. The answer required no debate. It was already evident in the faces around the table. Princess Anne answered first. Though she did not frame her response as an instruction, she stated plainly that silence had already begun to cause damage. What had once been discretion had turned into misrepresentation through inertia. The institution, she said, was now at risk, not because of the circumstances themselves, but because of how long they had been kept separate from public understanding. Prince William listened closely, his attention fixed on the progression being outlined. Rather than focusing on personalities, he understood that the significance of this meeting lay not only in the facts, but in the timing. Whatever decision emerged would not exist in isolation. It would establish a precedent for how truth was handled when it could no longer be shaped. As the details were reviewed, the nature of the problem became clear. This was not a crisis that could be absorbed quietly. It was not a situation that would resolve itself if given space. The implications extended beyond immediate family concern into the architecture of responsibility and continuity. Each participant recognized that the question was no longer whether the truth would surface, but how distorted it would become if the family failed to take ownership as the delay continued. The longer it waited, the more narrative control would shift elsewhere. Princess Anne focused on that risk with characteristic directness. She reminded the others that history rarely judged institutions for facing tragedy. It judged them for evasion. In moments like this, she said, credibility was not preserved by caution, but by clarity. No disagreement was voiced, but a visible adjustment occurred. The realization settled that the mechanisms the family had relied on for decades were insufficient for what lay ahead. This was not a situation that could be managed with incremental disclosure or carefully staged reassurance. Prince William's posture shifted subtly as the meeting progressed. He was no longer absorbing information. He was anticipating consequence. He understood that the decisions made in this room would accelerate his own transition in ways that preparation alone could not soften. By the time the discussion reached its natural conclusion, the meeting had changed in character. What began as an urgent gathering had become a moment of institutional self-definition. The participants were no longer asking how to proceed. They were deciding who they were willing to be seen as when the truth was spoken. Only one question remained unresolved. Not whether acknowledgement would come, but who could deliver it without dilution, defensiveness, or misdirection. The answer did not need to be stated aloud. The room almost unanimously turned toward Princess Anne, the line that cannot be crossed. Princess Anne waited longer than anyone expected before speaking. She allowed the silence to settle, not out of hesitation, but intention, and in that pause, the urgency gave way to something more exacting: attention. When she finally spoke, it was without preface. She did not summarize what had already been said or acknowledge the gravity of the situation she addressed. Instead, she stated plainly that the family had exhausted the usefulness of management in whatever this moment had become. It was no longer logistical or presentational. It had crossed into moral territory, and moral territory does not respond to strategy. Her authority was not asserted. It was assumed. Decades of service had given her a rare position within the family, built not on affection or fear, but reliability. She was known for consistency rather than persuasion. When she intervened, it was understood that she did so only when delay itself had become a decision. With clinical precision, she outlined the narrowing reality. The family had two remaining options. They could speak with accuracy and restraint, or allow the truth to arrive through fragmentation shaped by others with less information and fewer constraints. There was no third path. Time, she emphasized, was no longer neutral. It was actively eroding credibility. King Charles listened without interruption. Those present noticed the absence of resistance. Earlier in his reign, he had leaned toward precedent and incremental movement. Now there was no incremental space left. His stillness suggested not indecision, but recognition that the situation had advanced beyond the point where caution served its purpose. Anne turned her attention to Prince William, not with instruction, but inclusion. She spoke to him as someone whose future would be directly shaped by what happened next. The institution, she reminded him, could survive loss. What it could not survive was the impression that it avoided truth when truth became inconvenient. The residue of such moments, she warned, lingered far longer than the moments themselves. This reframing altered the dynamic in the room, shifting the discussion from consequence management toward responsibility. Anne made it clear that the goal was not to protect the family from discomfort. It was to protect the institution from corrosion. The critical shift came when she defined the boundaries of what could be said publicly. The statement, she insisted, must not minimize the reality of the situation. It must not imply uncertainty where none existed. And it must not suggest that deliberation was ongoing if it had already concluded. Any of those would constitute misdirection. Whether intended or not, her clarity disrupted the instinct to shield by omission. She reframed disclosure not as exposure, but stewardship. The monarchy, she said, had never survived by pretending to be untouched by difficulty. It survived by demonstrating that it could face difficulty without distortion. There was unease in the room, though no one voiced it directly. The discomfort was not rooted in disagreement, but in consequence, because once the truth was spoken plainly, it could not be retrieved or reframed, and they all acknowledged that fear without conceding to it. She reminded them that permanence was not some distant risk waiting in the future. It was already here, active and unavoidable. The events under discussion had already happened, and nothing said in that room could reverse them now. The only choice left was whether acknowledgement would be shaped by integrity or by calculation, and history, she noted quietly, was rarely forgiving of the latter. As the conversation turned to the practical question of who should deliver the message, Princess Anne did not immediately offer herself. She let the question sit in the open space of the room, allowing silence to do its work. In that pause, the answer became obvious without being spoken aloud. Her credibility in moments of institutional strain was widely recognized, not only within the family, but well beyond it. She was seen as neither sentimental nor self-protective, and that distinction mattered deeply now, more than titles or rank. When she did agree to speak, it was on strict terms. The statement would be factual and tightly contained. It would avoid conjecture entirely. It would not gesture toward future updates or hint at speculative improvement, and it would be delivered without emotional display. Tragedy, Anne insisted, did not require embellishment to be understood. Prince William acknowledged this with a single nod. That small gesture carried more weight than any speech. It signaled acceptance not just of the plan, but of the philosophical shift behind it. This was no longer about preserving comfort, it was about preventing further harm. With that, the meeting concluded. There were no closing remarks and no attempts at reassurance. The path forward had narrowed decisively. Princess Anne would speak. The family would stand behind her words without qualification, and whatever consequences followed would be met without revision. As they left the room, there was no sense of relief. Relief would have implied resolution, and there was none. What existed instead was resolve. The tragedy itself had not been created in that room, but its acknowledgement would begin there, shaped by a line Princess Anne had drawn and refused to let anyone cross. The news no one was prepared to hear did not arrive as a dramatic announcement. It arrived as a conclusion. That distinction mattered deeply to Princess Anne, who insisted the family confront the moment without the comfort of euphemism. What lay before them was not a sudden reversal, but the endpoint of a trajectory, quietly unfolding behind layers of caution and restraint. The briefing materials were precise and unsentimental. They outlined a progression that could no longer be interpreted generously. Medical assessments that once left room for adjustment had now converged. What remained uncertain was no longer the outcome, but duration, and even that uncertainty had narrowed enough to strip away illusion. Princess Anne requested the sequence of developments be reviewed from the beginning, not because she lacked familiarity, but because she demanded absolute clarity. Years of institutional service had taught her that ambiguity, even when unintended, became a liability the moment it left the room. If the family was going to speak publicly, every word would be weighed against what they already knew privately. As the timeline was restated, the emotional temperature in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. The earlier months, once framed as cautious optimism, now read as postponement. Decisions that had felt prudent revealed themselves as temporary shelters against inevitability. No one could escape the realization that hope had been doing work it was never meant to carry alone. The situation concerned a senior figure whose role extended far beyond family bonds. This was not private grief, confined behind closed doors. It touched continuity, expectation, and the psychological center of the monarchy itself. The implications radiated outward, affecting not just immediate relationships, but the pace at which responsibility would need to be assumed elsewhere. Prince William absorbed this in silence. He had known matters were serious, but the framing stripped away any remaining buffer. This was no longer about preparing emotionally for a possible future. It was about accepting that the future was arriving on terms not of their choosing. the distance between personal life and public duty collapsed further. At that point, King Charles spoke quietly, choosing his words with care, shaped by both experience and fatigue. He acknowledged that earlier decisions had been made to preserve stability. There had been a genuine belief that discretion served compassion. What he recognized now, with visible difficulty, was that discretion had reached its limit. Princess Anne responded not with criticism, but with reframing. She stated plainly that discretion had transformed into distortion the longer the truth remained unspoken. The longer it waited, the more harmful its eventual emergence would become. The family was no longer protecting anyone. They were increasing the damage silence would cause. This marked the emotional pivot of the meeting. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. What began as assessment became acknowledgement. The tragedy was no longer abstract. It had shape, direction, and consequences that would not pause for institutional readiness. Anne emphasized that public language could not suggest reversibility. To do so would invite false hope. And false hope, she argued, was cruelty disguised as kindness. That realization settled slowly. For a family trained to manage perception, accepting that some truths resist management was deeply unsettling. Yet no one argued. The facts, once spoken aloud, carried authority of their own. The final question was no longer whether the news would be shared, but how it could be shared without softening reality or amplifying pain. Anne made it clear, restraint, not reassurance, would guide them. The public did not need comfort. They needed honesty. By the time the discussion concluded, the emotional weight of the news had been fully absorbed. There was no visible collapse, but something more durable took its place: resolve, an understanding that this moment would define not just the coming weeks, but the moral posture of the family long after the fallout. The consequences of acknowledgement began unfolding before any statement was issued. The atmosphere shifted in ways hard to describe, but impossible to miss. Conversations slowed. Movements became deliberate. Everyone sensed they were standing at the edge of something irreversible for some members of the family. For some, the meeting forced confrontation with fears long compartmentalized. For others, it confirmed suspicions they had never wanted to voice. The shared experience was not shock. It was exposure. The protective distance between anticipation and acceptance dissolved. Prince William withdrew from view in the hours that followed. Not avoidance, but necessity. Those close to him later described a man recalibrating in real time. Responsibilities long prepared for now pressed closer. No longer theoretical, no longer remote. Their weight was immediate and personal. King Charles remained visible, though quieter than usual. His engagement with advisers was methodical, focused on continuity rather than reassurance. He understood leadership here required steadiness, not sentiment. Princess Anne, having accepted the role of messenger, shifted into a different mode entirely. She reviewed drafts with precision, bordering on severity. Each phrase was examined not for how it sounded, but for what it allowed others to infer. She rejected language that implied possibility where none existed, and cautioned against phrasing that invited speculation through omission. Generational differences surfaced more clearly. Older members, shaped by decades of restraint, struggled with the accelerating pace. Younger members recognized that time had become an adversary. Private discussions revealed long-standing divisions about transparency and modernization. These weren't arguments, they were reckonings. Past decisions were re-evaluated under the clarity of present consequence. Some admitted caution had slipped into avoidance. Others acknowledged that openness carried costs they hadn't fully considered. Princess Anne addressed these tensions directly in a smaller meeting later that day. She made it clear disagreement was not disloyalty, but inconsistency would be disastrous. Once the statement was delivered, there could be no internal contradiction. The family would stand together publicly, even if private emotions remained unsettled. The ripple effects extended outward. Senior staff adjusted schedules quietly. Protocols once theoretical activated without announcement. The institution responded not with chaos, but controlled adaptation. This was not a crisis of panic. It was a crisis of gravity. As evening approached, a sense of waiting settled over the household. The statement was finalized. The timing agreed. Nothing remained to negotiate. Everyone understood that once spoken, the words would permanently alter the landscape. No one believed acknowledgement would ease the pain ahead, but there was shared understanding that refusal to acknowledge would corrode trust beyond repair. The family crossed from preservation into responsibility. The tragedy had existed already, pressing against silence. What changed now was the choice to meet it openly, without disguise, and once that choice was made, there was no return to the comfort of not knowing. The decision for Princess Anne to speak publicly was not ceremonial. It was strategic, deliberate, and grounded in a clear understanding of how credibility functions when trust is strained inside the family. There was a quiet but firm agreement inside the palace that no one else could deliver this message without it getting twisted by expectation, sympathy, or outright suspicion. Anne's reputation for being blunt wasn't just helpful, it was the whole reason she was chosen. That was the point. Plain and simple. The statement was locked in for late morning, timed with care, but stripped of the usual royal choreography that normally cushions moments like this. There would be no advance briefings handed to favoured correspondents, no gentle leaks to soften the landing, no unnamed sources whispering reassurance behind the scenes. Princess Anne made it clear the words had to stand alone, raw and unfiltered by interpretation. If the truth was going to be acknowledged, it would arrive straight, not padded by intermediaries. In the hours before the announcement, Anne reviewed the final text by herself, line by line. She declined the presence of communications aides, asking instead for silence and space. This wasn't defiance, it was focus. She knew every word would be dissected, not just for meaning but for motive, for hesitation, for even the slightest hint of evasion. Even an accidental pause could be read as avoidance. The statement itself was lean, restrained, almost severe by design. It opened without pleasantries, without thanks, without appeals for understanding. Anne went straight to the point, confirming that the family was facing circumstances that had moved beyond earlier expectations. She acknowledged the seriousness without dramatics, choosing clarity over comfort every time. What the statement left out mattered just as much as what it included. There were no timelines, no hopeful projections dressed up as possibilities. No language designed to invite speculation or false reassurance. She promised no updates, suggested no reviews, and avoided every familiar phrase that usually buys time. Leaving those out was deliberate, because including them would have been dishonest. Anne spoke slowly, her tone calm and stripped of ornament. There was no visible emotion, but there was no cold detachment either. The weight of the moment came through restraint, not performance. Everyone watching could feel it. This wasn't theatre, it was acknowledgement. At one point, Anne paused briefly, not to steady herself, but to ensure precision. She clarified that the family had chosen to speak now because silence no longer served the public or themselves. That line, delivered without emphasis, hit harder than any show of sorrow could have. It framed the statement not as surrender, but as duty. The reaction was immediate and impossible to ignore. Within minutes, the exact wording was spreading worldwide, quoted word for word across platforms. Analysts pointed out the lack of euphemism. Commentators noted how unfamiliar it felt for a public conditioned to carefully managed royal narratives. The stark delivery left many unsettled, and that discomfort was telling. That disorientation did something powerful. It recalibrated trust. By refusing to guide emotion, the statement let facts stand on their own. The public wasn't told how to feel. They were simply informed from inside the household. In that moment, anticipation ended and consequence began. There was no applause when Anne finished, no visible release of tension. Those present understood this wasn't a conclusion, it was a crossing. King Charles was informed immediately, and once it ended, he asked for no revisions and no clarifications. He accepted the moment as final. His response, according to those nearby, was a quiet affirmation. The family had done what was necessary, not what was comfortable. Prince William, watching privately, reportedly remained silent for several minutes after the broadcast ended. For him, the statement narrowed the gap between present duty and future role. What had been said publicly would now shape every private decision going forward. Public reaction shifted fast. Shock gave way to sober analysis. There was little outrage and far less speculation than expected. The clarity of Anne's words appeared to shut down excess by naming the reality outright. Without embellishment, she reduced the space where rumours usually thrive. Medical professionals, constitutional experts, and commentators from multiple fields took note of the unusual candour. Some questioned whether the family had waited too long. Others argued that speaking earlier might only have shifted the timing, not the reckoning. What united most reactions was the sense that this moment was handled with gravity, not calculation, and Anne did not engage further after. She refused interviews and issued no follow-up commentary. In her view, the task was complete. Continuing to speak would only weaken the clarity she had established. In the days that followed, the statement was cited again and again as a turning point, not just for what it said, but for what it represented: a willingness to admit limits, a refusal to trade honesty for comfort. For Princess Anne, this was never about managing reaction. It was about drawing a clear line between silence and truth. Once crossed, there could be no retreat. The statement didn't resolve the tragedy, but it acknowledged it, and that did something lasting. It reshaped the relationship between the family and the public, proving that when necessary, candour would beat preservation. The institution felt different afterward, perhaps more fragile, but undeniably more credible. After the statement, there was no return to routine. The idea of normality often promised after royal crises simply didn't apply. What Anne confirmed didn't spark chaos, but it permanently altered the family's internal rhythm. A line had been crossed by choice, and once done publicly, it reshaped everything inside the household. The first change was silence of a new kind, not the heavy avoidance of before, but a quieter, deliberate stillness. Conversations became fewer but sharper. Decisions once delayed were handled directly. Time was no longer a buffer. For Anne, the aftermath wasn't about visibility. It was stewardship after speaking. Once she stepped back, there were no clarifications, no soft follow-ups to soothe audiences or commentators. Her philosophy was clear. Truth stated plainly doesn't need maintenance. Repeating it invites reinterpretation, and reinterpretation weakens what was already made clear. King Charles understood this instinctively. He avoided symbolic gestures meant to offset the weight of the announcement. No surprise appearances, no staged displays of continuity. His restraint sent its own message. The monarchy wouldn't perform resilience as spectacle. It would practice it quietly, behind closed doors. Preparations moved forward, not with panic, but with inevitability. Old contingency plans were revisited, refined, and responsibilities subtly redistributed without explanation. Those inside the institution felt the shift immediately. Authority didn't leap forward, it leaned. Prince William's role began to change in noticeable ways, even without formal announcements. His presence at briefings increased, his involvement in long-term planning deepened. The line between supporting and leading narrowed out of necessity, not ambition. The future suddenly felt closer, heavier, and harder to soften. Relationships within the family recalibrated. Some bonds tightened under shared reality, others strained quietly as paths began to diverge. Tragedy clarifies priorities, and not everyone reaches the same conclusions. Public reaction continued to evolve. Analysis turned into reflection. The lack of follow-up statements created rare space for restraint during public grief. Speculation slowed because the original acknowledgement left little room to expand narratives. Media coverage adjusted. Instead of chasing fragments, outlets began placing the moment in historical context, comparing it to earlier periods of irreversible change. What stood out most wasn't severity, but response. There was no attempt to spin reality into resilience. The family let truth stand unpolished. That choice reshaped expectations beyond reputation. Addressed candidly, the public recalibrated its relationship with the institution. Suspicion eased into sympathy in many quarters, not because the situation improved, but because it was named honestly. Trust may not rebound quickly, but it can stabilize. Anne didn't restore confidence with charm, she stabilized it with credibility. The emotional toll inside the family remained unseen. As always, acknowledgement didn't erase grief. It simply removed the burden of pretending it wasn't coming. Truth created space for privacy instead of destroying it. Weeks passed without escalation. No leaks contradicted the statement. No anonymous briefing softened its meaning. The family held the line. Silence became an extension of honesty, not avoidance. Long-term implications surfaced quietly. Conversations about modernization gained urgency. The balance between privacy and duty was reassessed in practice, not theory. Stability, it became clear, didn't depend on concealment. Anne's influence remained subtle but decisive. She pushed for fewer statements, not more, for consistency over reaction. Those principles guided every adjustment made afterward, always quietly, always deliberately. Prince William's preparation entered a new phase. His future responsibilities stopped being abstract. He navigated the shift without display, understanding that leadership in moments like this shows itself through steadiness, not announcements. Observers felt the change even without markers. Analysts noted a different tone, less performance, more deliberation. It wasn't universally praised, but it was widely respected. The tragedy Anne acknowledged didn't end the story, it reframed it. What followed wasn't resolution, but adaptation. The family moved from anticipation to acceptance, from preparation to practice. In the end, the most lasting impact wasn't the news itself, but the precedent it set, that when truth was required, the institution would speak plainly, once, and stand by it. That choice didn't make the future easier, but it made it clearer, and clarity in moments of irreversible change remains its own form of strength. If this breakdown helped you see what's really happening behind palace walls, hit like, subscribe, share this with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear what you think happened next.